All right, so welcome to another section of managerial economics. And in this section, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of monopoly. Now, we've said that perfect competitive markets and monopoly markets or monopoly firms, they are at the extreme end. So you realize that most of the characteristics that a monopolist have is almost directly opposite to that of a perfect competitor. Now, here we are going to define what a monopoly is, the characteristics, what factors make a firm a monopoly, and then what are the demand or how does the demand curve of a monopolist look like. Now here, we all know that a monopoly is a market which is dominated by a single producer. So in a monopoly, there is only one seller of the goods and services in the monopoly. Now, because he's the only one seller, usually what gives him the power of monopoly is that his goods are unique and there are no close substitutes. So that's another characteristics of a monopolist. Then also, the demand curve faced by a monopolist is the same downward demand curve. Now, what it means is that if we have a downward sloping demand curve from left to right, what it means is that when you change prices, quantity would change, okay? And when we're doing perfect competitive market, we said that the entire demand of the demand of the entire market is downward sloping. So here, since monopoly is the only firm in the market, it faces the entire demand of the market. So it has a demand curve that is downward sloping. And then monopolists are price makers. Now, when we say monopolists are price makers, it means that they are able to influence price. Now, they can do this in two ways. Either they set a price. So let's say they set P0 for people to buy K0, or they can control supply. Okay. So assuming this is their supply, they can reduce supply, holding demand constant, prices will rise. So monopolists cannot control both price and quantity at the same time. They can set prices for consumers to buy whatever quantity they want to buy, or they can change their output for it to reflect in prices. And normally that is what they do because there are regulations that regulate the activities of a monopolist. If there were no regulation, they can set price anyhow, but because regulations are there to restrict them from setting price anyhow, what they can alternatively do is that they can always decrease their supply so that the prices will rise by themselves. So because they are price makers, they can either choose a price for consumers to buy how much they want to buy, or they can either reduce their quantity for prices to buy, but they can't influence both price and quantity. So either they change price for consumers to buy how much they want to buy, or they can influence quantity. So if they increase their quantity, it means that so price will fall. If they reduce quantity, it means that prices will rise. So they are price makers, but they either choose price or quantity for it to reflect in price. They can't choose both price and quantity at the same time. What are some of the sources of monopoly power? What gives them power? What gives monopolists power to operate like the way they do? Number one is control over scarce productive resources. Of course, if monopolists or if a firm has control over resources that is scarce, that is unique, and what it means that no firm can have access to that resource, it will make the firm a monopolist because he's the only person who can produce a special type of good out of that resource. Number two is access to unique managerial talent. Access to unique managerial talent. So here, if your firm has a manager who has a very high level of knowledge and experience, that manager is able to use his knowledge and experience to control the market or to monopolize the market. So once a firm has a unique managerial talent, it gives the firm some form of monopoly power. The third one is location. Now, obviously, whenever a firm is the only firm at a certain location, maybe the firm is not the only firm producing that good across the country, but maybe in a certain location of the country, maybe they are the only firm there selling that good, it will give it some form of monopoly. The next one is the patent right. The next one is the patent. When we talk about patent is just an idea, all right? It is just, it's more or less like an intangible asset. A patent is an intangible asset, or it's more or less like an idea. Now, a patent is technically an exclusive right granted to an inventor by a government to produce a product or a process. So a patent is an exclusive right granted to an inventor by a government to produce a certain product or service. What it means is that if you invent something out of, let's say, a scientific research, or you have a certain idea that you use to invent something, once the government legalizes it for you and says that nobody else can use this idea or whatever you have invented, it means that you are the sole producer, or you will be the only person that will use that idea, or you'll be the only person that can produce that good from the idea. So here, nobody else can copy you, and that will give you some form of monopoly power. The next one is government franchise to be the sole producer of a good or a service. And this normally happens in the utility industry. For instance, the industry for electricity, the industry for water. Now here, because government thinks that if you give it to the private person, the person may exploit consumers. Usually government gives franchise to a government organization to be the only producer of that goods or service. And that also gives that organization or that firm some form of monopoly power. The next one is economies of scale. Of course, if a firm is able to gain advantages, or if a firm is able to lower its average cost as a result of producing on a large scale, that means that it will be very difficult for startup firms to enter that industry, and it will make the firm get monopoly power. The next one is economies of scope. So economies of scope is the reduction in cost because we are producing several products, okay? So if you remember, economies of scope occurs when the cost of producing two products in a single firm is lesser than producing the two products in separate firms. So that means that anytime a firm enjoys economies of scope, the firm is able to leverage on its cost. That means that it will be very difficult for a new firm to enter the market, and it will give the existing firm, and this will give the existing firm monopoly power. The next one is cost complementarities, and this occurs when the marginal cost of producing product A reduces when we produce more of product B, and vice versa, when the marginal cost of product B reduces when we produce more of product A. And this also simply means that cost complementarity can enable a firm leverage on cost, and it will be very difficult for other firms to enter, and that means that the existing firm would have monopoly power. So these are some of the sources of monopoly power. Okay. How does a monopoly maximize profit? And I'm going to take time and explain this curve to you for you to get it. So let's look at these curves, very interesting curve. So here, we have the demand curve of a monopolist. And then we have the marginal revenue of a monopolist. This is the demand curve of a monopolist, because I mentioned to you that monopolies have a normal demand curve because they set prices, and consumers will choose their own output, or they influence output for it to reflect in prices. So it has a normal downward sloping demand curve. Okay, now let's look at the total revenue curve. Now I want us to recognize that total revenue is an addition sorry, marginal revenue is an addition to total revenue. So once marginal revenue is positive and it is falling, total revenue will increase, but it will increase at a decreasing rate. Once marginal revenue becomes zero, total revenue will hit its maximum. And once marginal revenue crosses this x-axis and becomes negative, okay, once it becomes negative, then that means that because marginal revenue is an addition to total revenue, once marginal revenue becomes negative, that means that total revenue will now begin to decline. Okay, total revenue will now begin to decline. Okay, now let's look at the equation of a demand curve of a monopolist. Let's look at the equation of a demand curve of a monopolist. Let's look at the equation of a demand curve of a monopolist. Let's look at the equation of a demand curve of a monopolist. Now, we all know that the equation of a straight line is equal to y is equal to a plus bx. Y is equal to a plus bx. So typically the demand curve that we normally write is not the true reflection of this one. So technically, when we say QD is equal to A minus BP, because always there is negatively sloped, this demand curve is not the actual reflection of this demand curve, if you look at it carefully. Because the demand curve in the drawing, the price is the y-axis. So then the demand curve that we usually draw is actually a drawing for an inverse demand curve. Okay, the demand curve we draw is actually a drawing for an inverse demand curve because price is the one on the y-axis, quantity is the one on the x-axis. So actually the demand curve is supposed to look like P is equal to A minus B Q. This is the correct representation of a demand curve of this drawing. Okay, so this one normally is not the true reflection of the demand curve. In fact, if you want to draw a demand curve, you have to always change it to inverse demand curve before you can draw it, because the inverse demand curve is a true reflection of a line or the equation of demand, this one here. Because y-axis is always the dependent variable and price is on the y-axis. So actually the inverse demand curve is the real demand curve. Okay, all right. Now, inverse demand curve is when price is the subject and then, or when price is the dependent variable and then quantity is the independent variable. And I mentioned to you in class that we will get to a point where we will employ the inverse demand curve. Now, let's find total revenue. So total revenue is equal to price times quantity. Total revenue is equal to price times quantity. So here, if I multiply quantity by the price is A minus B Q. If I multiply quantity by the price, so I apply by another Q, I'll get AQ minus BQ squared. This is total revenue, okay? Finally, if I want to find marginal revenue, it is the total revenue over the quantity. But I've told you total revenue is equal to AQ minus BQ squared. So if I differentiate this function with respect to quantity, I'll get A minus 2BQ, because the Q will vanish, then 2 multiply B, then we subtract 1 from the power. So marginal revenue is equal to this. Now, all this thing I'm doing, I just want to show you something, okay? Now, the slope of the demand curve is minus B, but the slope of the marginal revenue curve is minus 2B. The slope of the marginal revenue curve is minus 2B. The slope of the marginal revenue curve is minus 2B. What it means is that marginal revenue is always twice steeper than demand. Marginal revenue is always twice steeper than demand. So you realize that the slope of the demand curve is minus B, but the slope of the marginal revenue curve is minus 2B. So always the marginal revenue curve here. So I'm showing you how we got the marginal revenue curve. So always the marginal revenue curve is twice steeper than the demand curve. So that means that the distance between here and here and the distance between here and here is the same, because this one cuts the triangle into two, perfect two. And the reason being that this line is twice steeper than this line. Okay. So assuming the quantity here is 400, it means that the quantity here will be 800. Assuming the quantity here is 500, the quantity here will be 1000. It's always twice. This one is twice steeper than this. And this one is also twice flatter. The demand curve is twice flatter as compared to the marginal revenue curve. Okay. So I'm showing you why the marginal revenue curve is steeper than the demand curve. And I've shown you why. Okay. Let's look at another relationship in these curves. Now, here in this region, we are saying that marginal revenue is positive, but it is what? Falling in this region. That means that the total revenue too will be rising, but it will be rising, or it will be increasing at a decreasing rate. Okay, it will be increasing at a decreasing rate. Now, when the marginal revenue becomes negative, total revenue will fall, because total revenue, or sorry, marginal revenue is an addition to total revenue, so it will begin to fall. Now let's look at what happens. Let's look at what happens again. Now, here, we can only move this way in quantity when we reduce prices. So let's note that quantity can only be increasing when we are decreasing prices. So let's note that quantity can only be increasing when we are decreasing prices. Okay. Now, here, when we are decreasing prices in this region, marginal revenue will be increasing. Sorry, marginal revenue will be falling, but it is positive. That means that total revenue will be increasing, even though it is increasing at a decreasing rate. Okay, even though it is increasing at a decreasing rate. Now remember that anytime when we reduce price and total revenue increases, the good is fairly elastic. So for fairly elastic, we decrease price to increase revenue. Okay. For fairly inelastic, we increase price to increase revenue. Remember that. On the other hand, it means that when you decrease price in fairly elastic region, you decrease revenue when it is fairly inelastic. Of course, when it is unitary elastic, changes in price does not affect revenue. When it is unitary elastic. When it is unitary elastic, changes in price does not affect revenue. So let's go back to our curve here. So here, what I want us to know is that for us to move on the quantity axis, it means that we have to decrease the prices to move this way. All right. So here, it means that when we are moving this way, it means we are decreasing prices. And in that region, total revenue is rising. So it means that anytime we decrease prices and total revenue rise, the good is what? Elastic. Now, in this region here, okay, if we are moving in this region, it means that we are still decreasing prices. But then in this region, we can see that total revenue begins to fall. So it means that this region of the demand curve, it is inelastic, okay? Because it is only inelastic, it is only in an elastic portion, or it is only in an inelastic situation. That is when a decrease in price will decrease revenue. So that means that this portion of the curve is inelastic, okay? This portion of the curve is inelastic. Then in between elastic and inelastic, we have the unitary. This one is the unitary elastic, all right? This one is the unitary elastic, okay? That's the unitary elastic. So that is the meaning of these curves here. That is the meaning of these curves here. Okay, that's the meaning of these curves here. Now, I have told you that I've shown you that the marginal revenue curve for a monopolist always lie below the demand curve, okay? It is as twice steeper as compared to the demand curve. So it lies below the demand curve. All right. Now, since it's a normal demand curve, it means that the relationship between marginal revenue and then the price and elasticity will be marginal revenue is equal to price into brackets 1 plus E, okay, divided by E. And I know we all remember this relationship. Marginal revenue is equal to price into bracket 1 plus E divided by E. Now, this means that when the good is fairly elastic, that means that E is greater than 1. Okay, so let's assume the good is fairly elastic. So let's assume E is, let's say, 2. Elasticity is 2 or negative 2, because always elasticity is negative, all right? Elasticity of demand is always negative. So when it is fairly elastic, or when elasticity is greater than 1, so I'm choosing negative 2 for us to look at a hypothetical situation. So the marginal revenue will now be equal to price into bracket 1 plus negative 2 is 1 minus 2, okay, all over negative 2. So this will give us P into bracket 0.5, and this will give us 0.5P. So marginal revenue will give us 0.5P. Okay, let's assume, so we've done fairly elastic situation. Let's assume that it is unitary elastic. We all know that when it is unitary elastic, elasticity is equal to 1, but it's always negative, of course. Price elasticity of demand is always negative. So E is equal to -1. So the marginal revenue will be equal to P into bracket 1 plus -1, that's 1 minus 1, all over 1. So marginal revenue will be equal to 0. Then, finally, when it is fairly inelastic, let's assume that elasticity is less than 1. So let's maybe choose -0.5, okay? -0.5. Okay, -0.5. So the MR will be equal to P into bracket 1 minus 0.5 all over -0.5. So we get MR to be equal to P into bracket -1. And you get MR to be equal to negative price. MR is equal to negative price. Now, these are the 3 conclusions we can derive from these things we've done. The first conclusion is that whenever a good is fairly elastic for a monopolist, Marginal revenue is positive, but it is always less than price. Because here we can see marginal revenue is equal to half of price. Okay. So whenever a good, so write these three conclusions down. The first conclusion is that whenever marginal revenue for a monopolist, whenever a monopolist faces a fairly elastic demand, its marginal revenue will be always less than its price, but the marginal revenue will be positive. Okay. Number two, when a monopolist faces a unitary elastic demand, marginal revenue will always be zero. Marginal revenue will always be zero. Okay. Number three, when a monopolist faces a fairly inelastic demand, marginal revenue is always negative because here we have MR is equal to negative price. So whenever a monopolist faces a fairly inelastic demand, marginal revenue is always negative. That means that their total revenue will always fall. So here, what it means is that economically, it is wise for a monopolist to produce in a market where the demand is fairly elastic. When it is unitary elastic, they will always make their total revenue will never increase because the marginal revenue is always zero. And when the market is fairly inelastic, their marginal revenue will always be negative. All right. So it is only reasonable for monopolies to produce in a market where the marginal revenue, in a market where the good is fairly elastic. Okay, in a market where the good is fairly elastic. So monopolies always produces in a market where the good is fairly elastic. All right. That means that they will always produce in a market where the marginal revenue is always less than the price, because when the good is fairly elastic, the marginal revenue is positive, but it is less than price. Okay. Now, this also brings in another intuition. This also brings in another intuition that when a firm's marginal revenue is always less than the price, what it means is that the firm will, so when this situation occurs, it means that the monopolist always decreases price to make more revenue. That is what this condition means. If your marginal revenue is always less than your price, it means that anytime you want to make more money, anytime you want to get an additional revenue, you have to decrease the price. Okay, that is the meaning of this notation. So the monopolist always decreases price to make additional revenue. So they always decrease price to make additional revenue. That is what monopolist always does. All right. So I think I've explained these things extensively. So monopolists always, so for a monopolist, their marginal revenue is always less than the price because they would always have to reduce price to make more money. All right. That means that their current marginal revenue will always be lesser than the former price if you look at it with a mathematical intuition. But all that I want you to understand is that for a monopolist, they always have to reduce price to increase or to get additional revenue. Okay. Now, this means that for a monopolist, their power is constrained. And we did this when we were beginning. For a monopolist, always their power is constrained by the elasticity of demand, right? Their power is constrained by the elasticity of demand. Another thing we must also recognize is that perfect competitive firms, they don't have any market power. If you think about it, perfect competitive firms, they don't have any market power. The reason being that market power is price minus marginal cost over price. And perfect competitive firms, their price is equal to their marginal cost. So it will be 0 over P, and it's 0. So perfect competitive firms, they don't have market power actually. Okay. All right. That is a slight twist for perfect competitive firms. So now let's come back to our monopoly. I just wanted to chip in that. Okay. So what is the demand function of a monopoly? So I've already told you that the demand function of a monopoly is always the inverse demand function. Price is equal to 10 minus 2Q. This is a typical example of an inverse demand function. What this simply means is that anytime a monopolist changes quantity, it will reflect in the price because price depends on quantity. And I've already explained to you that this is what monopolists they do. They always alter quantity to reflect in the price. So let's look at this example. Suppose the inverse demand function for a monopolist product is given by 100 minus 2Q. Okay, it's given by 100 minus 2Q. What is the maximum price a monopolist can charge to be able to sell 3 units? So to be able to sell 3 units, the price that they can charge will be price equal to 10 minus 2Q. So price equal to 10 minus 2. 10 minus 2 into bracket 3. So this will give you 10 minus 6, which is 4. All right. 10 minus 6, which is 4. So the price is equal to 10 minus 2Q. And what is how much price should they charge to be able to sell 3 units? So if the price is equal to 10 minus 2 into bracket 3, and you get 4 cedis. Okay. All right. Then the question says that we should now find the marginal revenue. Now, marginal revenue is equal to change in total revenue by change in quantity. But total revenue is equal to price times quantity. Okay. So total revenue will be the price function, which is 10 minus 2Q times quantity. So total revenue will be 10Q minus 2Q squared. That is total revenue. And then marginal revenue will be DTR over DQ. And that will give us 10 minus 4Q. So this is the marginal revenue. So at 3 units, the marginal revenue will be equal to 10 minus 4 into bracket 3. All right. Yes. So here, so 10 minus 4 into bracket 3, that will be 10 minus 12. The marginal revenue will be negative, so minus 2. That will be the marginal revenue. All right. The marginal revenue will be negative. Okay. So the marginal revenue is negative. Now, what it simply means is that the monopolist is probably facing an inelastic demand curve, because I told you that a monopolist will have a negative marginal revenue when the demand is inelastic. So let's confirm that. So P is equal to 10 minus 2Q. Okay. That means that when we want to find quantity, the minus 2 will cross. So 2Q is equal to 10 minus P. Divide both sides by 2. You have Q is equal to 5 minus 0.5P. Because here will be over 2, here will be over 2. So that's what will happen. All right. So if the price is 4, okay, the quantity is 3, as the question gives. But you can, I mean, if you want to try it, you can do 5 into bracket 5 minus 0.5 into bracket 4, you get 3. But that is not really necessary. I just wanted to show you that you can do that, but it's not really necessary. So when the price is 4, the quantity is 3. All right. Now, price elasticity of demand is equal to dQ over dP times P over Q. All right. But then we don't have a quantity function, we have a price function. So price is equal to 10 minus 2Q. So dP over dQ, we will get minus 2. All right. So that means that if you want to know dQ over dP is the inverse of dP over dQ. So that will give us 1 over minus 2, all right? Because the P over the Q is minus 2. So the inverse to get the Q, the P over the Q is minus 2. So the inverse, which is the dq over the P, means that you do 1 over minus 2. So this is the Q over the P. All right, dq over the P. Okay, now going forward, that means that the dq over the dp is negative 1 over 2. So this formula now will be negative 1 over 2 times the price, which is 4, over quantity, which is 3. So when you solve it, you get negative 0.677. This is what? Fairly inelastic. Fairly inelastic. And that is why this is fairly inelastic. And this proves that whenever a monopolist is operating in a fairly inelastic market, the marginal revenue will be negative, like what we had here. All right, this proves that. So I can give you a question like this, and I can ask you to find the price elasticity of demand from this question, and you should be able to do it, like how I've done it. Okay. The output decision. Now, when do we maximize profit in a monopoly? When do we maximize profit in a monopoly? When do we maximize profit in a monopoly? Okay. Now, to maximize profit in a monopoly, our total revenue curve is like this. Our total cost curve is like this. So the maximum total revenue is here. The minimum total cost is here. So this is the point where you maximize profit, all right? Because we have the maximum total revenue. Oh, too bad. Okay. So this is the total cost. And then this is the total revenue. Okay. So the maximum total revenue and then the minimum total cost, that is when we will maximize our profits. So if I want to do a profit curve, this is when we will maximize, this is the point where we will maximize our profits. Okay. All right. Now, here, what it means is that the point where we will maximize total revenue, it means that we will differentiate the total revenue and equate to 0. That is when we will maximize total revenue. Because if you want to look at the turning point of total revenue, it is differentiating the total revenue and equating to 0. You know the turning point of total revenue. When you also differentiate total cost and equate it to 0, you know the turning point of total cost. So it means that at profit maximization, the TR over the Q, we all know that it's marginal revenue. So marginal revenue is equal to 0. And our profit maximization, marginal cost is equal to 0. So if all the two are equal to 0, it means that we can now equate the two of them, okay? So at profit maximization, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And marginal cost should be rising. So the profit maximization point for a monopolist is when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Please, it is not when price is equal to marginal cost. That one is for a perfect competitor. But for a monopolist, it is when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Okay, that is the profit maximization point for a monopolist. Okay. So let's look at the curves as well. Now in these curves, this is our demand curve. This one is our demand curve. D is our demand curve, this curve, okay? Then always, you know that when we do the marginal revenue curve, it must fall faster than the demand curve. In fact, it should cut the space into two, like what we see here. So, and I told you why. The marginal revenue curve is always twice steeper as compared to the demand curve, okay? Okay, now, the equilibrium point is achieved when marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So we will draw a marginal cost curve like this. So where the marginal cost where it cuts the marginal revenue, that is the equilibrium point. Where marginal cost cuts the marginal revenue, that is the equilibrium quantity. Okay, that is the equilibrium quantity. Now, to get prices, I said monopolies can set quantity, then the quantity would reflect in the price. So we can trace this quantity to the demand curve, because the demand curve is a curve of combination of price and quantity. So once I trace this quantity to the demand curve, I'll get the price. So this is the equilibrium price, okay? This is the equilibrium price. So once I trace the quantity that is gotten from the interaction between marginal cost and marginal revenue, once I trace that quantity to the demand curve, I'll get my price. Okay, so this is the equilibrium price, this is the equilibrium quantity. All right. So that is how we determine it for a monopolist, okay, for a monopolist. And then we all know that marginal cost passes through the minimum of the average total cost, okay. So if you also trace this same quantity to the average total cost, you will not get the average total cost. If you trace the same quantity to the average total cost, you will not get the average total cost. And I remember I told you that the region where price exceeds the average total cost is your profit. Okay. Because price means total revenue per unit. Average total cost means total cost per unit. So price minus average total cost simply tells profit per unit. It tells profit per unit. All right. And then, so this portion is our profit. So we are going to use an example to show this for you to get it better. So in this example here, suppose the inverse demand curve for a monopolist is 100 minus 2K. Suppose the inverse demand curve for a monopolist is 100 minus 2K. All right. And then the total cost is 10 plus 2K. So suppose the marginal cost for a monopolist is 100 minus 2K. Suppose the price is 100 minus 2K, and then the total cost is 10 plus 2K. Determine the profit maximizing price and quantity, and then the maximum profit. Okay. Now, for a monopolist, the condition to know the profit maximizing quantity is when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Okay. Now, but marginal revenue is equal to total revenue, change in total revenue by changing what quantity. And then, but total revenue itself is equal to price times what quantity. So the price is 100, but the question price is 100 minus 2K. And then the total cost is 10 plus 2K, okay? So price times quantity will be 100 minus 2K multiplied by K. So you get 100K minus 2K squared. This is the total revenue. That means our marginal revenue would be change in total revenue over change in quantity. You get 100 minus 4K. Okay, that is the marginal revenue. The marginal cost will be change in total cost over change in quantity. So when we differentiate this total cost function, the marginal cost will be equal to 2. All right, the marginal cost will be equal to 2. Marginal cost will be equal to 2. Now here, what this means is that at the point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, we will have 100 minus 4K to be equal to the marginal cost of 2. All right. So we will now get 100 minus 2 is equal to 4K. So we will get 98 is equal to 4K. So K is equal to 98 divided by 4, and you get 24.5. So it means that the profit maximizing quantity is 24.5. Okay. The profit maximizing price is 100 minus 2Q. So the price will be 100 minus 2 into bracket 24.5. That will be 51. So the profit maximizing price will be 51. Okay. Will be 51. All right. We can equally find the profit maximizing average cost. So here, average cost is total cost over quantity. So the total cost was 10 plus 2Q. So the total cost 10 plus 2Q, that's 10 plus Q into bracket 24.5, because the quantity is 24.5. So 10 plus 2 into bracket 24.5, we'll get 59 to be the total cost. Okay. That means that the average cost will be total cost of 59 divided by the quantity of 24.5. So the average cost is 2.41. This is the average cost. All right, this is the average cost. Okay. Now let's come to our diagram. So we draw a demand curve. We draw our marginal revenue curve. Okay. And we are saying that at equilibrium, marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So we draw a marginal cost curve. And this equilibrium point, the quantity was 24.5. Okay. The quantity was 24.5. But we can't get price from here because price is not the same as marginal cost like a perfect competitor. So we have to now trace this to the demand curve to get the price. Because demand curve is a curve that combines price and quantity. So this will be our price. And the price is 51. Okay. The price is 51. We also need to find the average cost. The average cost. The average cost. So here, the average cost is 2.41. The average cost is 2.41. So we all know that once we trace this quantity to the average cost, we'll get the average cost to be 2.41. All right. And we are saying this portion is the profit. How much the price exceeds the average cost is your profit. That means that we will find the area of this rectangle. Okay, so that is the profit region. Now, to get the profit is simply length times breadth, okay? So the length is 24.5. The distance between here and here is 24.5, okay? Then the breadth is the distance between 51 and this. So, I mean, if you don't round it, you get a very long figure, all right? So when you are working, you can work with a very long figure so that the answers are not so different. So when you don't round it, when you subtract 51 minus 2.41, you get 48.59. So you multiply by 24.5, you get 1190.455. So this is the profit from this calculation. Alternatively, we can do profit calculation without the graph. But I want you to learn the graph because I will always examine you with the graph. I'll say illustrate your answer on the graph. So here, if you want to find a profit without the graph, profit is total revenue minus total cost. And total revenue is equal to price times quantity. And the price was 51, the quantity was 24.5. So 51 times 24.5, you are going to get 1249.5. And total cost, the cost function was 10 plus 2Q. So 10 plus 2 into bracket 24.5. That will be the total cost. So this will be 59. Okay. So total revenue minus total cost will be 1249.5 minus 59. And you get 1190.5, which is the same as when you are using the, if you round this, you get 1190.5. So when you use the curve or you use the normal way we find profit, you should get the same answer. But I want you to learn how to illustrate the answers on the curve. Okay. Like how we did for the perfect competitive market. Okay. The supply curve of a monopoly. Now, the next question we should ask ourselves is, does a monopoly have a supply curve? The simple answer is that there is no supply curve for a monopoly, because for a monopolist, since the firm has market power, okay, since firms have market power, the firm is the only producer in the market. So the firm, it doesn't have a supply curve because the firm can influence prices without even the supply curve, because it's the only firm in the market. So monopolies usually does not have market power because they determine how much to produce based on the marginal revenue. Okay, they determine how much to produce based on the marginal revenue. So if you understand, or if you understood the curves I was drawing for marginal revenue when I was trying to say that it is much steeper and all that, if you understand this concept that they produce based on the marginal revenue. So they'll produce up to the point where the marginal revenue is positive. They won't produce to exceed the point where marginal revenue is positive. All right. Let me show you. So for a monopolist, they'll produce here within this region here. The region where, so the quantity will always be within this region. They won't produce a quantity in the second region. They will get negative marginal revenue. So they will always produce in this first region, right? Okay, so monopolies do not have a supply curve because what they supply is determined by the marginal revenue. The final thing, and the last but one thing under monopoly is multi-plant decisions. Multi-plant decisions. Now, sometimes monopolies may produce goods using 2 machines or using 2 plants, okay? When it happens like that, it means that each plant will have their marginal cost separate. But then each plant will produce a certain amount of goods, which will mean that the final price of the product will depend on the output coming from the 2 plants. So let's look at this example. Let's assume that price is equal to 70 minus 0.5 kilo. Okay, price is equal to 70 minus 0.5 kilo. Price equal to 70 minus 0.5 kilo. The marginal cost of plant 1 is 3 kilo 1. The marginal cost of plant 2 is kilo 2. All right. I just want you to understand this. You may not be examined on this, the multi-plant decisions of a monopolist. Okay. Now let's look at the profit maximizing situation. Now, the profit maximizing situation is when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. But here we have price to be equal to 70 minus 0.5 kilo. Marginal cost 1 is equal to 3 kilo 1. Marginal cost 2 is equal to kilo 2. Okay. So total revenue will be price times quantity That would be 70 minus 0.5 kil times kil. So total revenue will be 70 kil minus 0.5 kil squared. That will be total revenue. Now marginal revenue will be equal to change in total revenue over change in quantity. That will be 70 minus, when you multiply 2 by 0.5, you get 1. So 70 minus kil is the marginal revenue. Now, because we are producing in 2 plants and then the 2 plants will give the final output, it means that the quantity itself is the quantity of plant 1 plus the quantity of plant 2. In essence, marginal revenue will be equal to 70 minus kil 1 plus kil 2 because the kil is kil 1 plus kil 2. So marginal revenue will be equal to 70 minus kil 1 minus kil 2. All right. So at equilibrium, MR is equal to MC. So we have 2 MCs. So the MR 70 minus Q1 minus Q2 is equal to MC1. The marginal cost 1 is what? 3Q1. Then another equilibrium is when the marginal revenue 70 minus Q1 minus Q2 is equal to marginal cost 2. That's MC2, which is what? Q2. Marginal cost 2 is Q2. Marginal cost 1 is 3Q1. So we have to now solve these equations simultaneously to get the output. We have to solve the equations simultaneously to get the output. Okay. So let's use the substitution method. So we have 2 equations. 70 minus Q1 minus Q2 is equal to 3Q1. 70 minus Q1 minus Q2 is equal to Q2. All right. So equation 1, equation 2. So let's make Q2 the subject of maybe equation 1. Okay. So make Q2 the subject of equation 1. So here, Q2 will be equal to 70 minus Q1 plus, 70 minus Q1 minus 3Q1. So Q2 will be equal to 70 minus 4Q1, okay? And this will be equation 3. So when we do the substitution, we are using substitution method. So we can substitute Q2 into, so we now substitute what happened? Okay. So we now substitute Q2 in equation 2, all right? So everywhere we see Q2, we can put 7 minus 4Q1 there. So 70 minus Q1 minus, into bracket, 7 minus 4Q1 is equal to Q2 is there. So we can replace Q2 by 7 minus 4Q1, all right? So we now have, it's 70, not 7, sorry. 70 minus 4Q1, okay. So we can now have 70 minus Q1 minus 70 plus, so minus, so plus 4Q1 is equal to 70 minus 4Q1. So this 70 and negative 70 will cancel. And then minus Q1 plus 4Q1, we'll get 3Q1 is equal to 70 minus 4Q1. So when this minus 4Q1 crosses, we will have 3Q1 plus 4Q1 is equal to 70. So 7Q1 is equal to 70. When you divide both sides by 7, Q1 is equal to 10 units. All right. So we are now supposed to find Q2. Remember that Q2 is 70 minus 4Q1. So Q2 is 70 minus 4Q1. So Q2 will be 70 minus 4 into bracket 10, means that Q2 is 70 minus 40, and is equal to 30. All right, so Q2 is equal to 30. It means that the total output generated by the two plants will be 30 plus Q1 was 10. So 10 plus 30. So the total output generated by the two plants will be what? 40. And since the price determines, since the price depends on the total output, the price was given as 70 minus 0.5 Q. So the final price will be 70 minus 0.5 into bracket 40. That will be 70 minus 0.5. 0.5 times 40, I think, is 20, right? Yeah. The final price will be 50 cedis. All right. So that is how we solve for multiple plant decisions. So how much output should be sold? The output that should be sold to maximize profit is that we should sell a total output of 40, where 10 will come from plant 1 and 30 will come from plant 2. And what price should be charged? The price that must be charged is 50 cedis. All right. And all these things are here. All these things are in the calculations I have done. Okay. So the final thing we have to do on monopoly, the final thoughts on monopoly. The final thought on monopoly. Now, we should know that the presence of monopoly does not always mean that they will make profit, because the extent to which monopolies will make profit is where the average total cost curve lies in relation to the demand curve. So here you realize that when the marginal cost meets marginal revenue here, all right, and we trace the demand curve, we have the price to be this. Assuming the average cost curve is also lying at that point, when we trace to the average cost curve, it means that the average cost also will be the same as the price. Okay, so monopolies will always make profit when the average cost curve lies below the price. Once it lies below the price like this, it means that the price will be bigger than the average cost curve, and it means that we will make profit. But once it lies at the same place as the price, we will break even. And once it lies above the price, it means that the average cost will be bigger than the price and we will make losses. So here is losses. And once it lies at the point where it is just equal to the price, we will break even. And once the average cost curve lies below the price, you make profit. Okay. So monopolies don't always make profit as we think. It will depend on where the average cost curve lies. And I've shown you that. Finally, what are the implications, or what are the societal implications of a monopoly? Now, I would want us to know that monopoly is not the most efficient form of a market structure. In fact, the most efficient form of a market structure is a perfect competitive market. Because in perfect competitive markets, the competition is very high. And then that means that all the producers will produce at the minimal cost, because we are doing high competition. And nobody will produce at a high cost. All of them will produce at a minimal cost. Now, for a monopolist, because he's the only person producing, he may not even produce at a minimal cost because nobody is challenging him. So for a monopolist may waste societal resources. Think about it. When ECG, which is the sole, or let's say, assuming VRA is the sole producer of electricity in Ghana, okay, they can pay their employees fast salaries. They don't really care about their cost because nobody is competing them, because they think they can always price their products above their cost. So they may even not be producing at the most efficient cost because nobody is competing them. All right. So that is what happens with monopolies. But with current competitive firm, because you are in a very high competition, you have to produce at the minimum average cost. Okay. All right. So we are going to show us. I'm going to show you the situation mathematically. I'm going to show you the situation mathematically. All right. Now, let's watch this curve. Remember that the marginal cost curve is always the supply curve. Remember that. That the marginal cost curve is always the supply curve. Remember that. Now, for a perfect competitor, the equilibrium price is determined at where price is equal to marginal cost. Okay. So this is the equilibrium price of a perfect competitor where price meets marginal cost. Remember, where price meets marginal cost. That is the price of a perfect competitor. Now, for a monopolist, the equilibrium price is determined at where marginal revenue meets marginal cost, not where price meets marginal cost. Remember that. It's determined at where marginal revenue meets marginal cost. So always the marginal revenue curve will fall flatter than the demand curve. So this is the marginal revenue curve here. So where marginal cost meets marginal revenue, that is the equilibrium output for a monopolist. Okay. And when we trace it to the demand curve, we did this a short while ago. When we trace it to the demand curve, then you get the price of a monopolist. So this is the price of a monopolist. Now what happens? What happens is that monopolist always produces a less output because this is the output of a perfect competitor. This is the price of a perfect competitor. This is the price for a monopolist. This is the output for a monopolist. So monopolist produces less output and charges a higher price than a perfect competitive industry. So monopolist always produces a lesser output and charges a higher price, as we can see, than a perfect competitor. All right. So monopolist always produces less output and charges a higher price. All right. That means that society should be willing to pay more if we are in a monopoly than a perfect competitor. So let's look at the implication. The implication will lead to what we call deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is a welfare loss because the producer charges a higher price. So let's show it mathematically. Now, to understand this concept, I need to teach you a concept called consumer surplus and producer surplus. Now, when we say consumer surplus, okay, by definition, consumer surplus is the difference between the price that a consumer is willing to pay for a good and the price that he actually pays for the good. All right. The difference between the price a consumer is willing to pay for a good and then the price he actually pays. So for instance, if I'm going to buy, let's say I'm going to buy a certain book, and in my mind, the book is 50 cedis. So I prepared that I'm going to buy the book for 50 cedis. When I get there, they said the book is 30 cedis. So the consumer surplus is the difference, 20 cedis. So consumer surplus is the difference between what a consumer is willing to buy for a good, or how much a consumer is willing to pay for a good and how much he actually pays for it. All right. On the other hand, producer surplus is the difference between how much a producer is willing to accept for a product and then the actual price he pays for it. All right. So producer surplus is the producer surplus is the difference between how much a producer receives for a product and how much he's willing to receive for a product. So, for instance, if you're a producer and you are bringing your goods to the market, and in your mind, oh, these goods, I'll be able to sell it for 5 cedis. And you go and you're able to sell it for 7 cedis. That is the 2 cedis is your producer surplus. So producer surplus is the difference between how much a producer sells a good and then how much he was willing to sell it, all right? So in a diagram like this, whenever we have demand and supply, okay, in a diagram like this, whenever we have demand and supply in this diagram, so this is demand and this is supply. So whenever we have demand and supply in this diagram, this portion of the diagram is called consumer surplus. Because at all these points, all these prices, if you find the prices here, that is what any consumer will be willing to pay, which is far more than how much he actually ends up paying. All right. So this whole region here is the consumer surplus. And then producer surplus is the difference between the prices he was willing to accept as a producer and then the prices he actually gets. So normally the price he actually gets, or the equilibrium price, is more than, when it is more than what he was willing to accept, it means that he has a producer surplus. So this region here is the producer surplus. Okay. Now, let's bring it into our analysis. Let's bring this into our analysis. Remember that for a perfect competitive firm, price is equal to the marginal cost. And also remember that the marginal cost is the supply curve. Remember that. Marginal cost is the supply curve. Remember that. I think we've done it severally. Marginal cost is the supply curve. Okay. All right. And then we will have our demand curve. We will have our demand curve. So our demand curve is the normal downward sloping. So our demand curve is the normal downward sloping. And it must pass through here because at equilibrium, demand is equal to supply. Remember that. And the supply is the marginal cost curve. The marginal cost curve on supply. Okay. So this is the situation for a perfect competitor. So for a perfect competitor, all this portion here, it is the consumer surplus, all right? And then this portion here is the produce. So here is the consumer surplus for a perfect competitor. And then the one down here is the producer surplus for a perfect competitor. So here, this region is the producer surplus for a perfect competitor, okay? Because their price is equal to the marginal cost. Now, for a monopolist, remember that at equilibrium, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And their marginal revenue always slopes faster than the marginal cost. So this is their marginal, sorry, than the demand curve. So this is their marginal revenue curve, okay? At equilibrium, for them, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So the equilibrium is this point, okay? The equilibrium is this point. That's the equilibrium quantity. Now, if you trace the quantity to the demand curve, we will now get the equilibrium price. So that is the equilibrium price for a monopolist, PM. And this is the QM for a monopolist. And then I think this one, we even did it a short while ago. I think I did it on the slides. Okay. So here, this is the equilibrium point, or this is the equilibrium price for a monopolist and all that. That means that for a monopolist, monopolists will always take away a portion, this portion of the consumer surplus. Monopolists will take away this portion of the consumer surplus. And then he will take away this portion of the producer surplus, the original producer surplus. It will take this portion of the producer surplus away. So a monopoly will always lead to poor welfare, because if you take away somebody's consumer surplus, you are reducing his welfare, all right? And if you take away a producer surplus, what it means is that the producer is not producing at an efficient cost. He's wasting resources. That is why he doesn't have producer surplus, all right? So always, the monopolist will take away the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Now, if you take away the consumer surplus, that portion is called the dead weight loss. Dead weight loss of the consumer. The portion of the consumer surplus that has been taken away by the monopolist is called the dead weight loss. And the proportion of the producer surplus that has been taken away by the monopolist is called producer dead weight loss. Weight loss, okay. And I'm going to show you how to compute these things mathematically, and then that will be it for the discussion on monopoly. So I'm going to show you how to compute the dead weight loss. I'm going to show you how to compute the dead weight loss. Let's look at this example. Okay. Consider a monopolist that faces the following market demand and total cost. So the market demand is Q is equal to 22 minus 5P. Q is equal to 22 minus 5P. All right. Q is equal to minus 5. Sorry. Q is equal to 22 minus P over 5. Q is equal to 22 minus P over 5. Total cost is 100 minus 10Q plus Q squared, right? The question says that find the profit maximizing price and output for this firm. At this price and quantity combination, what is the consumer surplus? Now, we all know that here, total revenue is price times quantity, all right? Because we have to find marginal revenue, and then we have to find marginal revenue, and then equate it to marginal cost before we can get the price, okay? And then equilibrium quantity. So at equilibrium, for a monopolist, total revenue is equal, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, okay? So we have quantity to be equal to, the quantity is equal to 22 minus P over 5. Remember that a monopolist always uses the inverse demand function, so we have to make price the subject. So if you multiply 2 by 5, you have 5Q is equal to 22 times 5, I guess, is 110. So 5Q is equal to 110 minus P, all right? That means that price is equal to 110 minus 5Q, okay? Total revenue is price times quantity. And we will have 110 minus 5Q times Q. And this will give us 110Q minus 5Q squared, okay? 110Q minus 5Q squared, that is the total revenue. All right. Now, marginal revenue will be change in total revenue over change in quantity, and that will give us 110 minus 10Q when you differentiate. So that is that. The question says that total cost is equal to 100 minus 10Q plus Q squared, okay? So marginal cost is change in total cost over change in quantity. We will get minus 10 plus 2Q. So at the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, we will have So MR is equal to MC. We will have 110 minus 10 kil is equal to minus 10 plus 2 kil. So let's group like 10. So you have 110 plus 10 is equal to 2 kil plus 10 kil. So you have 120 is equal to 12 kil. If you divide both sides by 12, you get kil to be equal to 10. So for the monopolist, the profit maximizing quantity is 10. Okay, the profit maximizing quantity is 10. Now let's find the profit maximizing price. And remember, the price is here. So the profit maximizing price, P is equal to 110 minus 5 kil. So price will be equal to 110 minus 5 into brackets 10, because the quantity is 10. And this will give us price to be what? 60, all right? So we can illustrate this on a graph. We can illustrate it on a graph. So we have our, so here we have our demand curve, we have our marginal revenue curve, and then the equilibrium quantity is achieved at where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So the marginal cost curve is here. So this is marginal cost, this is marginal revenue, and this is the demand, okay? So the equilibrium quantity is where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. The equilibrium quantity was 10. If I remember, just a moment. Yes, so let me bring my marginal cost somewhere here for some reasons. So we have, oh no. Okay. So marginal cost is here. So the equilibrium output here is 10. Okay. Now, to get the equilibrium price, so this is marginal revenue and this is demand. To get the equilibrium price, we must trace, because marginal revenue curve cannot give us price. So to get the equilibrium price, you must trace the quantity to the demand function to get the equilibrium price. So the equilibrium price is 60, all right? The equilibrium price is 60. Okay, the equilibrium price is 60. Okay, now if you remember the consumer surplus is this region, all right, where we have price and we have the demand curve. So the consumer surplus is here, this whole region, because the price is here, the demand curve is here. So the consumer surplus is here. Now, how do we find the area of a triangle? The area of a triangle is half base times height. The area of a triangle is half base times height, okay? So half base, the base, this base is 10 because we have between 0 and 10, so the base is 10. But then the difficulty is to get the height because we don't know the price here. We don't know the price here. Now, how do we get the price here? The price here can be gotten when we equate quantity to be 0, because if you draw a curve or a graph and you plot something here, when you plot something here, it is the price when the x-axis quantity is 0. So this thing here is the y-axis figure when the x-axis figure is 0, all right? So to get the price, the intercept price, or the price at when quantity is 0, you get price to be equal to 110 minus 5 into bracket 0. So the price is 110. So at the price at where quantity is 0, that price is what? 110, okay? So that's how we can get the price here. So half base, the base is 10, and then the height is the distance between here and here. The height is the distance between here and here. That is the height. So the distance is 110 minus 60. The distance is 50, all right? So the area will be half base times height, and that will be 250. So the consumer surplus is 250. The consumer surplus is 250. Okay. Now, the next thing is that how much profit is the monopolist earning? What is the profit of the monopolist? The profit of the monopolist. Profit is simply total revenue minus total cost. And remember, total revenue is price times quantity. So the price is 60, the quantity is 10. So total revenue is price times quantity, which is 60 by 10. Okay, 60 times 10. All right. Now, total cost means that we will put the quantity in the cost function. And the cost function was 100 minus 10 K plus K squared, okay? So you get 100 minus 10, the quantity is 10, okay? Plus 10 squared. So 100 minus 10, okay? So I think you get 100. So the monopolist profit is the total revenue, which is 600 minus the total cost, which is 100. So the monopolist profit is what? 500 cedis. That is the monopolist profit. It is 500 cedis. The next requirement of the question is suppose that the government sets regulation to set a perfect competitive price in the long run. Compute the consumer surplus. So if the government forces the firm to be a perfect competitive firm in the long run, compute the consumer surplus. Now, when we were doing perfect competitive firms, I showed you something that in the long run, for perfect competitive firms, their price is equal to their average total cost. I showed you this. It's equal to their marginal cost for a perfect competitive firm. Their price is equal to the average total cost, is equal to the marginal cost. So once we don't have the price can be replaced by the average total cost. Once we don't have the price, it can be replaced by the average total cost, because the equilibrium is when price is equal to marginal cost for a perfect competitor. So once we don't have price, it can be replaced by the average total cost or the minimum average total cost. That was actually what we did. Price equal to the minimum of average total cost equal to the marginal cost. If you have forgotten, you can refer to the video on the perfect competitive market. So since we don't have price to equate to the marginal cost, what it means is that we have to find the minimum average total cost as a representative of the price. Okay. Now, the total cost is equal to 100 minus 10K plus K squared. So the average total cost will be 100 over K minus 10 plus 2K. So this is the average total cost. How do we find the minimum of the average total cost? We will differentiate the average total cost with respect to quantity, and we equate it to 0, because anytime we want to find the minimum point of a curve, we will differentiate that curve and equate it to 0. All right, I can rewrite the average total cost as 100 raised to the power negative Q raised to the power -1, okay? Because 100 over Q, I can write it as 100 Q raised to the power negative 1 minus 10 plus 2Q. So that we can do the differentiation will be simpler for us. So when we are differentiating this, we will have minus 1 multiplying 100, we have minus 100. 10 will vanish because it's a constant. So minus 100, so you get minus 100 plus 1. So minus 100 Q raised to the power negative 2, sorry. Just a moment. Okay. So minus 100 Q raised to the power negative 2, right? Because you subtract 1 from the power again. So you multiply negative 1 by 100, you subtract 1 from the power. This constant will vanish, and then this thing here plus 2 is equal to 0. When you differentiate this function, you get this. Plus 2 is equal to 0. All right, plus 2 is equal to 0. Okay. All right, I think I made a slight mistake. Sorry about that. Tiredness is setting in, but I think I made a slight mistake. Okay. Now, when you divide everything by quantity to get the average total cost, you get 100 over Q minus 10. If you divide Q squared by Q, you get Q. You not get 2Q. Okay, you get Q. Sorry about that. You get Q. You not get 2Q. You get Q like this. Okay. So when we differentiate, you get minus 100 Q raised to the power negative 2 plus 1. Because the Q here will turn into 1 when you differentiate. It's equal to 0. All right. So we have minus 100 Q negative 2 plus 1 is equal to 0. That means that 1 is equal to 100 Q raised to the power negative 2, right? 100 Q raised to the power negative 2. Okay. Now, when you solve this thing, if we divide both sides by 100, you get 0.01 is equal to Q raised to the power negative 2. We divide both sides by 100. So this is the same as saying 0.01 is equal to 1 over Q squared, all right? So cross multiply, we have Q squared is equal to 1 over 0.01. So Q squared is equal to 100, and then Q squared will be equal to 10. If you find both sides, if you find square roots, you have Q to be equal to 10, okay? So it means that the minimum of the average total cost occurs at where Q is equal to 10, okay? That means that if we put this Q, which minimizes average total cost, into the average total cost function, we should get the minimum average total cost. Because this Q is the quantity that minimizes the average total cost. So if I put this quantity in the average total cost function, I'm supposed to get the minimum average total cost. All right. So the average total cost function was 100 over Q. So the average total cost was 100 over Q minus 10 plus Q. So it will be 100 over 10 minus 10 plus 10. $100 over 10 minus 10 plus 10. So you have 10 minus 10 plus 10. So it means that the minimum average total cost is equal to 10, okay? The minimum average total cost is equal to 10. And we are saying that in the long run of a perfect competitive market, the price is equal to the minimum of the average total cost. That means that to find the equilibrium point where price is equal to marginal cost, the minimum of average total cost can replace the price. It can replace price because price is equal to the minimum of average total cost. That means that the price is also equal to what? 10. So we are now going to find the equilibrium point for assuming the firm was a perfect competitor. We are now going to find the equilibrium point. So the equilibrium point is when price is equal to marginal cost, but price is equal to the minimum of the average total cost and is equal to 10. So it means that the price is 10, okay? What is our marginal cost? Marginal cost is change in total cost over change in quantity. So the total cost function, if you remember, the total cost function was 100 minus 10 K plus K squared, okay? So marginal cost will be, if you differentiate total cost with respect to quantity, marginal cost will be minus 10 plus 2K. This is marginal cost, okay? So for a perfect competitor, assuming the firm was a perfect competitor, the equilibrium point is price is equal to marginal cost, and the price is 10. Marginal cost is minus 10 plus 2K, all right? So when this one, you have 10 plus 10 is equal to 2K. So 20 is equal to 2K, and then K is equal to 10. You divide both sides by 2, all right? So if you want to bring this on the diagram, note that the price of a perfect competitor that the firm can set is 10. The quantity of a perfect competitor will be also 10. So the price is 10. The quantity is also 10, right? The price is 10. The quantity is also 10. Now, this thing here would have been the case if the firm is a perfect competitive market. But the firm is not a perfect competitive market. So this thing will not hold for the firm. But I just wanted you to see something. That's why I showed it. Since the firm is not a perfect competitive firm, their output depends on price and their price depends on output, either ways, okay? So if you remember, the question said quantity is 22 minus P over 5, if you remember. So quantity will be equal to 22 minus 10 over 5. That will be 22 minus 2. So the quantity is 20. The quantity is 20. Now let's bring them into our nice drawing here. Let's bring them into our nice drawing here. So assuming the firm behaves like a perfect competitive firm, even though it is not, its price will be 10, but the quantity will depend on the price because it's not a perfect competitive firm. So the quantity will be 20. So let's bring it into the firm. So put in your mind that the price is 10, quantity is 20. So let's bring it into this graph. So for a perfect competitive firm, the price at equilibrium, the price is equal to the marginal cost. All right, so it will be here. And it's equal to demand and supply. So the price, as you can remember, the price is 10, the quantity is 20. Okay, so the price is 10. The quantity is 20. All right, the price is 10, the quantity is 20. Now, what we are going to do is that we are going to find the dead weight loss. We are going to find the dead weight loss, and then that will end our section on monopoly. We are going to find the dead weight loss. We are going to find the dead weight loss. But the question before that, the question says that we should calculate the consumer surplus at this price. We should calculate the consumer surplus at this price. So the consumer surplus will be the whole of this region here, everything here. So the whole of this region, because it will be here, here. When we ignore the monopoly and we are doing perfect competitor, this would have been the entire consumer surplus. And I think I've shown you already. So how do we compute this consumer surplus, entire consumer surplus? It is half of the base times the height. So the base is from 0 to 20. So half times base. The base is from 0 to 20. So half of the base, which is 20. And then the height will be the difference between 110 and 10. The height will be the difference between 110 and 10. So that will be 100. So here we will have half of 20 times 100. So the consumer surplus will be 1,000. So assuming the firm was a perfect competitive firm, the consumer surplus will be this whole region, which will be 1,000. Now, I believe by now we have a fair idea of the deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is the consumer surplus that will be lost. Is the consumer surplus that will be lost because it's a monopoly. So if it's a monopoly, the line will pass here. Remember that. And this portion will now represent the deadweight loss of the consumer. So this deadweight loss, we are also going to find it. And the same thing is half of the base times the height. So this small thing here, the base is 20 minus 10 here. And then the height is 60 minus 10. So the base is 10, the height is 50, all right? The base is 10, the height is 50. So the deadweight loss will be half of the base 10 times the height, which is 50. That is 60 minus 10. So we will have 0.5 times 10 times 50, and that will be 250, all right? So the consumer deadweight loss is 250, all right? The consumer deadweight loss is 250. So we are finished solving the question. And this question is very examinable. So try and solve it on your own again. Just go through the Monopoly video and you should be able to solve the question on your own. All right. Go to the Monopoly video if you solve the question on your own. So this will bring us to the end of the section on Monopoly. This will bring us to the end of the section on Monopoly. So I'm going to do the next section on monopolistic competition. Okay. All right. So you meet in the next section.